There is a reason these words are reaching you at this exact moment. The person you love has been carrying something inside their heart for far too long, and now they have reached a point where silence is becoming more painful than the truth. They have one last message for you, and before you assume this is just another apology, another memory, or another attempt to reopen a door that was already closed, listen carefully. Because what they want to tell you is connected to the very reason everything between you changed. They know they may not get another opportunity. They know you may have already started convincing yourself that whatever existed between you is over. But somewhere inside them, there is still one truth they cannot walk away from. For a long time, you may have wondered how someone who once seemed so connected to you could suddenly become distant. How could someone who knew your heart so deeply become quiet when you needed answers the most? You replayed conversations. You remembered little moments. You searched for the exact point where everything changed, but nothing ever fully made sense. And that is because you were trying to understand a story while one of its most important pages was still missing. The person you love knows that now. They know their silence created questions you were forced to answer on your own, and some of those answers made you believe you were forgotten. But you were not forgotten. There were nights when they almost reached out to you. They picked up their phone, found your name, and stared at it longer than they would ever admit. Words were typed and erased. Messages were written but never sent. They wanted to tell you everything, but every time they came close, fear stopped them. Not necessarily fear of you, but fear of what would happen once the truth was finally spoken. Because some truths do not simply explain the past. They change the meaning of everything that happened. And now something has shifted. Recently, they were forced to confront a memory they had been avoiding. Something reminded them of you in a way they could no longer dismiss. Maybe it was a place, a conversation, an old photograph, or simply hearing words that sounded exactly like something you once told them. Whatever it was, it broke through the emotional wall they had spent so much time building. Suddenly, all those feelings they had pushed down came rushing back, and with them came a realization they were not prepared for. They realized you may never know what was actually happening behind their silence. They realized you may spend the rest of your life believing they simply stopped caring. And that thought has started haunting them. Don't skip this, because their last message is not simply, "I miss you." It goes much deeper than that. What they desperately want you to understand is this: I know my silence made you believe you meant less to me than you actually did. I know my distance probably looked like a decision. But there were things happening around me and inside me that I never knew how to explain. I thought staying silent would prevent more damage. Instead, I created the very pain I was trying to avoid. Those words were difficult for them even to admit to themselves. They know you waited for clarity. They know there were moments when one honest conversation could have changed everything. Yet they allowed pride, confusion, pressure, and fear to stand between you. At first, they believed there would always be more time. Another week. Another month. Another opportunity to explain themselves. But time kept moving, and the distance between you became larger. Now they are afraid they waited too long. Something inside them is telling them that if they remain silent again, the door may finally close, not because you stopped caring, but because you learned how to live without the answers they refuse to give you. And this is where their message becomes even more emotional. They want you to know that your absence affected them more deeply than anyone around them realized. They smiled when they needed to smile. They continued with their responsibilities. They acted as though life had simply moved forward. But certain moments became unexpectedly difficult. A familiar song. A place connected to an old memory. A phrase you used to say. Even ordinary days could suddenly remind them of what was lost. They began comparing the peace they once felt around you with the emptiness they felt after you were gone. That comparison changed something inside them. They started asking themselves questions they had avoided for far too long. What if I misunderstood everything? What if I allowed other circumstances to control a decision my heart never truly accepted? What if the person I walked away from was actually the person I was supposed to have an honest conversation with? Those questions have become impossible to silence. And there is another part of this message they need you to hear. They do not expect you to erase what happened. They know saying, "I'm sorry" cannot magically undo nights when you were left confused or moments when you questioned your own importance. They know trust cannot be demanded simply because regret has finally arrived. That is why they are not asking you to pretend nothing happened. They are asking for one thing: do not let their silence become the final version of the story. Because there was more behind it. Much more. There was one moment in particular when they were extremely close to telling you everything. They had made up their mind. They were ready to stop hiding behind excuses and finally explain what had influenced their choices. But before they could do it, something happened that convinced them to remain silent again. And that decision became one of their biggest regrets. For months, they told themselves it was better this way. They told themselves you would eventually move forward and forget them. But deep inside, another thought kept returning. What if you were waiting for the truth while they were waiting for the courage to speak it? Now they understand that courage arriving too late can look exactly like regret. Their last message is becoming clearer. If there is still even one unanswered question inside your heart, please don't assume my silence was the answer. I should have spoken. I should have trusted you with the truth. And if I could return to that moment, I would choose honesty instead of fear. But there is still one thing they have not said. One detail that explains why they pulled away when their heart was telling them to come closer. And once that truth is finally revealed, you may understand why this message feels so urgent, because the person you love has discovered something they never expected, and now they are terrified that by the time they finally tell you everything, you may already have closed the door forever. The truth they were afraid to tell you was never simple. It was not one argument, one misunderstanding, or one careless decision that created the distance between you. There were layers behind it, things they heard, things they believed, and things they were too afraid to question at the time. The person you love is finally beginning to understand that some of the decisions they made were based on fear rather than certainty. And what hurts them most now is realizing that while they were trying to protect themselves from something they thought might happen, they ended up destroying something that was already real. There was a period when they began hearing things about your connection that made them question everything. Certain people around them had opinions. Some believed the relationship was too complicated. Others made them wonder whether you would eventually walk away. Small doubts were repeated until those doubts began sounding like facts. And instead of coming directly to you and asking for the truth, the person you love made the mistake of keeping everything inside. They watched you differently. They interpreted your silence differently. They began seeing rejection in moments where there may have only been confusion. Slowly, without realizing it, they started preparing themselves for heartbreak before heartbreak had even happened. That was when their behavior toward you changed. You probably felt it. The warmth became inconsistent. Conversations became shorter. Things they once explained openly suddenly became hidden behind words like, "I'm fine" or "nothing is wrong." There were moments when you could sense something had shifted, but every time you tried to understand it, they pulled further away. What you could not see was the battle happening inside them. One part wanted to trust what they had experienced with you. Another part was terrified that everything they had been warned about might eventually become true. And then came the moment that changed everything. They misunderstood something connected to you. It may have been something they heard, something they saw, or something that reached them without the full context. At the time, it seemed convincing enough to confirm every fear that had already been planted inside their mind. Instead of asking you what it meant, they became quiet. They told themselves your actions had already given them the answer. That was the moment they began emotionally stepping away. But recently, they learned something that completely changed the meaning of that moment. The information they trusted was incomplete. The conclusion they made was not the whole truth. And suddenly, they were forced to look back at every decision they made afterward. Imagine realizing that the moment you used to justify walking away from someone may have been misunderstood from the beginning. Imagine remembering every unanswered message, every cold response, every opportunity you ignored because you thought you were protecting yourself. That is the emotional place this person has found themselves in now. They keep returning to one painful question: why didn't I just ask? Why didn't they come to you directly? Why didn't they give you the opportunity to explain? Why did they trust fear more than the connection they had experienced with you? There is no easy answer, and they know that. Don't skip this, because something even deeper happened after they discovered the truth. They went back through memories they had spent months trying to avoid. Suddenly, certain things you said began making sense differently. Moments they once interpreted as distance now looked like pain. Times when they believed you did not care suddenly looked like moments when you were waiting for them to communicate. And then they remembered one particular conversation. You had said something to them that seemed ordinary at the time. Maybe you told them that honesty mattered more than perfection. Maybe you asked them simply to speak to you instead of assuming what you felt. Whatever the exact words were, they did not fully understand their importance then. They understand them now. Because the very thing you were asking for was the thing they failed to give you. Honesty. They began wondering how different everything might have been if they had sat down with you for one conversation instead of disappearing behind silence. Maybe there would still have been pain. Maybe difficult decisions would still have needed to be made. But at least both of you would have been making those decisions with the truth in front of you. Instead, you were left with questions. And they were left with regret. That regret became even heavier when someone close to them recently asked a simple question: if you truly believed walking away was the right decision, why are you still thinking about this person? They could not answer. For the first time, every excuse they had used stopped working. They could no longer say it was simply nostalgia because the emotions were too strong. They could no longer say they had completely moved on because your memory still had the power to change their entire mood. They could no longer blame everything on circumstances because they were beginning to recognize the choices they themselves had made. That night, they finally admitted something privately that they had resisted for a very long time: they still cared. Not because the past was perfect. Not because they wanted to pretend nothing painful happened. They cared because beneath all the confusion, fear, distance, and mistakes, the connection had never become meaningless to them. And that realization terrified them. Because caring about someone is one thing. Realizing you may have lost that person because you failed to communicate is something entirely different. They started thinking about you moving forward without them. They imagined you finally reaching a place where their name no longer created questions inside you. They imagined someone else eventually receiving the honesty, patience, and love they were too frightened to give when they had the opportunity. And suddenly, waiting became unbearable. That is why this message feels like their last message. Not because something terrible is about to happen. Not because you are required to make an immediate decision. But because they understand that emotionally, there comes a point when a person cannot keep asking someone to wait for answers. They know you deserve peace. Even if that peace eventually means a life without them. And perhaps that is the hardest sentence they have finally learned to accept. Their message to you is this: I cannot ask you to forget what my silence did. I cannot ask you to trust me simply because I finally understand my mistake. But I need you to know that you were never as easy for me to lose as I made it appear. There were countless moments when I wanted to come back and explain everything. I was afraid. I kept waiting for the perfect moment, and while I waited, the distance between us became something neither of us originally wanted. But their confession does not stop there. Because after admitting all of this, they finally decided to find out exactly where that misunderstanding had come from. They started asking questions. They returned to the person who had originally given them certain information. They wanted details this time. No assumptions. No emotional interpretations. They wanted the complete story. At first, the conversation seemed ordinary. Then one question changed everything. The person they were speaking with suddenly became uncomfortable. Their answers became vague. Details that once sounded certain were now being described differently. And the person you love immediately noticed. They pushed harder. What exactly did you know? There was silence. Then came an answer they were not prepared to hear. The person admitted that they had never actually known the complete truth about you. Some of what they had said had been based on assumptions, second-hand information, and their own interpretation of what they believed was happening. Your person felt their stomach drop. Because they suddenly understood the scale of what had happened. They had allowed incomplete information to influence a decision that affected both of your lives. But then something even more shocking was revealed. There had been one piece of information about you that never reached them at all. Something that could have changed their understanding much earlier. Someone had known about it. Someone had an opportunity to tell them. But for reasons your person still does not fully understand, that information remained hidden. Now they want to know why. And this is where their final message becomes something much bigger than regret. Because they are no longer only asking whether they made the wrong decision. They are beginning to ask whether they were ever given the full truth before making that decision. For the first time, they are looking back at the separation differently. They are noticing conversations that happened at strange times. Advice that seemed unusually forceful. People who encouraged them to move forward quickly without speaking to you first. None of this automatically proves that anyone intentionally wanted to separate you, but it has created questions they can no longer ignore. And one question stands above all the others. What was the missing information about you? They finally received the answer. For several seconds, they said absolutely nothing. Because the truth was connected to something you had tried to communicate long ago, something they had misunderstood completely. Suddenly, your silence did not look like rejection. Your distance did not look like indifference. And one decision you made, which they had spent so long believing meant you no longer cared, had actually come from a completely different place. That realization broke something open inside them. They understood that while they had been waiting for evidence that you cared, you may have been waiting for evidence that they trusted you. Both of you were waiting. Neither of you knew what the other was carrying. And time kept moving. Now the person you love wants one conversation, not to pressure you into returning, not to demand forgiveness, and not to rewrite the past. They want one honest conversation where nothing is hidden anymore. But there is one final thing they are afraid to tell you. Because when they discovered what had really happened, they also discovered that someone close to the situation had known for much longer than they admitted. And when your person confronted them and asked, "Why didn't you tell me this before?" the answer they received left them completely silent. Because that person did not say, "I forgot." They did not say, "I didn't know." Instead, they looked directly at your person and admitted there was a reason they stayed quiet. And that reason was connected to you. The person finally lowered their eyes and admitted that they had been afraid of what would happen if the full truth about you came out. They knew your person still had deep feelings for you, even when they pretended otherwise. They had seen how your name could change their expression within seconds. And they believed that if your person ever understood the complete truth, they would immediately question every decision that had pulled you apart. That was why certain details were never shared. Not because you had done something unforgivable, but because someone believed they knew what was best for your person. Your person could barely process what they were hearing. All this time, they had believed they were making their own decision with all the facts in front of them. Now they realized that an important part of the story had never reached them. They asked one final question: did you ever try to explain this? The answer hurt more than anything else. Yes. You had tried. You had tried in ways they never fully recognized. There were moments when you wanted to speak, but the distance had already become too painful. There were moments when you waited for them to ask you one honest question. But that question never came. Your person suddenly remembered every time you looked like you had more to say. Every unfinished conversation returned to their mind. Every moment of silence now carried a completely different meaning. And for the first time, they understood that you may have been hurting while they believed you simply did not care. That realization brought them to tears. Not because they expected the past to magically change, but because they finally understood what their fear had cost. They cannot return and undo those days. They cannot erase the nights you spent wondering why they disappeared emotionally. They cannot demand another chance simply because the truth has finally reached them. But they can finally give you what they should have given you from the beginning: honesty. Their last message to you is simple. I am sorry I believed assumptions before I asked for your truth. I am sorry I allowed silence to speak for both of us. I am sorry I made you question whether what we shared ever mattered. It mattered more than I knew how to admit. And even if you never choose to reopen this door, I needed you to know that. They are not asking you to forget your pain. They are not asking you to abandon the peace you have worked hard to rebuild. They simply refuse to let a misunderstanding become the final truth about your story. If another conversation ever happens, they want it to be different. No hidden information. No outside voices deciding what either of you should feel. No assumptions replacing honest questions. Only two people finally saying what should have been said a long time ago. And if that conversation brings closure instead of reunion, they are prepared to respect that too. Because this time, loving you means respecting your choice. Your person has finally understood that real love cannot survive through fear, silence, and assumptions alone. It requires courage when the truth is uncomfortable. It requires listening before judging. And sometimes it requires admitting that you were wrong before it becomes permanently too late. So whatever happens next, one mystery is finally over. You were not forgotten. You were not meaningless. And their silence was never proof that their heart felt nothing. The truth simply arrived later than it should have. Now the final decision belongs to neither fear nor the people around you. It belongs to the two hearts that lived through this story. Whether those hearts meet again or finally choose separate roads, the unanswered questions no longer have to follow them. And that is where this chapter finally ends, not with another secret, but with the truth finally spoken.